Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar, When Protestors Come to Church. I'm Roy Harriman, your host here with Ministry Pacific, and we're delighted to have you as our guest today as we're going to unpack an increasingly important topic. And we have an expert guest joining us today, Vaughn Baker, president of Strategos International. Well, Vaughn has quite a long biography. In fact, it would take up our whole program if I went through it all, but I'll just concisely say that he is a true expert on not only church security, but corporate security. As a former law enforcement officer, is active in his own church where he formerly led the security ministry for many years. And we're privileged to have him with us. So as we begin this topic, I do want to throw out a caveat, and just to be clear that we're not dismissing the value of peaceful protests. If you know church history, you know that some protesters have been heroes of history. However, there are also just as many examples of protests that either turn violent or simply very annoying, or some that are dangerous to all involved. So, for example, in the UK right now, there's a movement called Just Stop Oil, where people are going and like literally laying down on highways and causing great chaos. But we're not here to talk about social political. We're here to talk about churches and ministries protests and how to handle them. So, Vaughn, let's jump in and think about this. In weighing how to respond to a protest, how important is it for us to understand the goal of the protesters?
Well, and this is true with not only protesters, but any sort of crisis event that's man-made is we make every effort we can to understand what their goals and objectives are, whether it be anything from a protester to a disgruntled person to all the way up to an active threat. It's important to understand what their motivations and goals are, generally speaking, because once we know that, then we can develop protocols that will prevent them or mitigate them from accomplishing their goals. So it's critical that we know, generally speaking, what their goals and objectives are.
So when it comes to protesters, emotions run high. What are some of the likely goals that they may want to achieve at a church or a ministry setting?
Well, you just said something there that's really important when we talk about emotions running high. And that's why you should plan in advance for protesters, because here's what we know about emotions. When emotions run high, logic is low. And when people respond emotionally versus logically and versus a pre-planned approach and a pre-planned response, usually bad things are going to happen. And it won't be the protesters that'll be the subject of the news media anymore. It'll be the response to the protesters where somebody might have overreacted. And we already fight that anyway. So that's why it's really important that we understand that reality and the importance of preparing in advance. As far as what their goals are, it's severalfold. The first is they want to disrupt whatever the event is. And once they disrupt that, they're hoping they can gain some sort of attention. And depending on if they're a protester that has a cause, sometimes it's important to understand some protesters don't even have a cause. I'll give you an example. Up at a church in Michigan, we had a group. It was an anarchist group that disrupted a church service, and their goal, when they were asked by a reporter a year later after the protest, they asked, "Well, what is your goals? What are you trying to get attention for?" And they said, "We're not trying to get attention for anything. We're just trying to cause carnage." And really, that's what you've just heard there. Causing carnage is the definition of an anarchist. So some of them don't have any goals, is what I'm saying. So even though we'd like to know what that is, but some of them are just there to cause carnage and disrupt in general.
It sounds like usually, with the exception of, like you say, this anarchist group, it is publicity. We want publicity. And if we can make you look bad at the same time, it's a double victory per se.
And sometimes one of the other goals that sometimes they're trying to do is they're trying to elicit an overreaction or an escalated response that is too much. That in itself will end up getting much more coverage than their protest alone. So that's why we need to prepare in advance.
Say if you have a church, well, some churches are known for taking bold stands on social and cultural issues. Others are not. If you're a church that is more low profile, isn't quote unquote political, do you need to be concerned that you may drive in one morning and there's protesters surrounding your building?
Absolutely. And because it's not about what you really say from the pulpit, it's not about what you really believe, it's about what the perception is. And many times perceptions are not accurate, but sometimes perceptions are reality. So uh, you could be a church that preaches what you believe to be biblical truth and you preach it with grace and love. But because it is a biblical truth, you know that saying is that the truth sometimes hurts, and many people are allergic to the truth, that alone will elicit an emotional response, and sometimes even worse than protest. So if you represent uh, a church that preaches on against same-sex marriage, maybe against the life and death choices that people make regarding abortion, Roe versus Wade. There might be some perceived political stances that the churches are taking when we talk about religious freedom causes, things of that nature. Those are all topics that will create a very emotional response in some people. But I don't want to limit it to just uh, those particular topics. Sometimes you see churches protesting other churches. I know with my church, we had a church, Fred Phelps and his gang, that came to our church and protested because they didn't feel like we preached against sin strong enough. And anybody that's been to our church would know that's not the case. But they were kind enough to let us know in advance that they were coming, and we had plans in place for them. But it turns out a big rainstorm came, and they weren't nearly as motivated as they proclaimed to be. And the rain chased them away. We didn't even have to respond. So, or if you look at Joel Osteen's church down in Texas, big mega church down there, there was another church that protested him, and interrupted their services. So it's not limited to just secular versus faith based. Sometimes it's faith based against other faith based organizations.
Based on those examples you shared, it's almost you're like rolling the dice as who may come, and the protest that you described, that kind of the ideology is pretty incoherent. Why are they really here? Yeah, who knows? But the facts on the ground are still the same, regardless of the motivation.
And Roy, let me just say, our society has become so polarized that now we have people that have make a profession out of being offended, and it's we call them the professionally offended crowd. They're looking for a reason to be offended about something.
Of course, it's helpful, probably just at least in a marginal way to this discussion, to understand that there are people who are professional protesters, that they make a living going from city to city, stirring up chaos.
We did protection for news crews at all four Ferguson riots, as well as riots in Chicago, Milwaukee, Charlotte, many of the locations. And you ended up seeing some of the same faces all over the country because they are being bussed in and paid to go protest and be anarchists as well.
Well, when we talk about protests, let's kind of, based on your experience and what you've observed, break down the types of protests. So essentially, one is you have the people outside with the signs, and then another one, which I've seen you discuss, is where they don't make themselves known as protesters immediately, but once the service begins, then they begin a highly visual disruption. And there may be some other types. What are the kind of types of protests that people might need to consider that could occur on their property?
People that interrupt events and services, whether it be school board meetings or religious services, whatever, we put them into two categories. The first is the protesters. That means they have an agenda, they have goals and objectives, and they could or could not even believe those goals and objectives. Some of them believe them, some of them don't, depending on if they're being paid or not. The second would be the disgruntled, those that are disgruntled that are interrupting. We see these are people that could have legitimate gripes. And not to say protesters don't have legitimate gripes, but people that are offended about something that's happened to them personally or their family personally. We see these at the school board meetings. So there are two different types of protests or interruptions of those events that could occur. And so one of the things that we recommend for any public event or public service, we recommend part of your life safety plan that you have a designated protester area. And that way, when protesters show up and all of the major events that we've done protection for, we do in our life safety plan outline a protester area, and we tell people when the protesters show up, we're to tell them, hey, over here is our designated protester area. You're welcome to do it over here lawfully. If you do it outside of this area, then we are going to ask that you leave. And any attempt to remain at that point will be seen as trespass. So building that into your life safety plan is important. Rather than saying you don't have the right to protest, which isn't true, we give them a place to do that. Sometimes it's quite a ways away from where the activity is taking place.
What are the legal rights of protesters, and then where do they cross the line? What can we say? Okay, well, they're certainly within their rights to do that. And then when do I need to begin paying attention and thinking about, do I need to engage law enforcement or security team?
Well, most of the time, people have the right to protest, and now it depends on where they do that is different, and how they do it is going to be governed by ordinance and statute. It varies from municipality to jurisdiction, and it varies. But in many jurisdictions, it will determine where they can do that. They can't obstruct traffic unless that's already been designated as a pedestrian area for the gathering itself. They can't disrupt foot traffic either. Many times it's going to say how close they can be to each other. You can't interrupt ingress and egress, as well as the flow on crosswalks or sidewalks. So before you designate and before you plan for a protest, you need to understand what your local statutes and ordinances say. So now we can put a plan together that falls within the boundaries and within what the law says you can do. And then, but some of them that are professional protesters, and I'll say the Fred Phelps crowd, his church, most of their family with that particular church that protests a lot of different funerals and everything else, they are lawyers and they actually research what the laws are in that area. And what we don't want to say is you don't have a right to do that, because they know better. And now we're talking about free speech issues, and now we probably not a criminal concern, but it could end up being a civil concern if we prevent them from doing that.
Help me out here. Public property, obviously in most cases you can be on public property, but do protesters have a right to protest on private property?
Well, it depends on what they're doing and how they're doing it. And most of the time, we can determine who can come on our private property and who cannot. But in some events that we've done, they've rented out stadiums that we've done life safety planning for and provided protection services for. And of course, if you bought a ticket and you have a right to be there, now there's a code of conduct usually that will dictate how you're to behave when you're in that event. But for the most part, we can determine who can remain on private property and who cannot. But what they do when they're in there, now we could get into other things besides trespass. We could get into local ordinances regarding disorderly conduct, how they're behaving while they're there. And that's the other reason why we want to have a code of conduct for what behavior we're going to allow when they're there. And if they're in violation of that code of conduct, that's what we're going to reference when we ask them to either discontinue that behavior or if they need to leave. Or depending on what they're doing, we can say, we're not even going to give you a chance to discontinue it. We're going to ask you to leave right now.
So it sounds like it's important to know your local laws. And I assume if you don't know what those are, that your local law enforcement agency could potentially be a partner in helping you understand that?
Yes, and I would rather understand it before I ended up on the wrong side of the crossbar motel. Definitely want to know that ahead of time.
So yeah, like essentially a consultation, your security team or your leadership team, tell us if this happens, what should we do? How should we handle it? They could potentially be an ally for you there.
Yes, and your church's legal counsel and general counsel could provide some guidance there and what the local laws are as well.
So it sounds like in general, if someone's behaving themselves and they're on the sidewalk in front of your property and they have signs, as much as it may bug you, there's really nothing you can or should do in a situation like that.
Well, I know some churches, they chose to take the high road. They go out and take them water, and they're making an every effort. I know with our particular protest that we had the week before it occurred, that we knew it was going to happen. Even our pastor from the pulpit told congregation members, "Hey, we're expecting a protest next week. we would encourage you as congregation members not to engage them, because some people, when you're protesting their home church, are going to, again, emotions are high, logic is low. They're going to overreact, and then those people will get the reaction that they're looking for many times.
We're going to have on this webinar today churches with varying degrees of security teams. Some may not have a security team, some may have a sophisticated one, and as you say, you're always wanting to learn and develop and grow. But when it comes to protesters, and say you had a 10 commandments of churches handling protesters, I'm going to guess that let the security team handle it would be like near the top of your 10 commandments.
Security team and church leadership, whether that's pastoral or operations leadership, let them deal with it. Many times we end up, and of course, there's been situations in a disgruntled situation where we had a disgruntled church member interrupt services at my church. We ended up providing safety and security for the person that was disgruntled, because we had a church member that was getting ready to go hands-on. We were there to protect him as well. So our job is to keep everybody safe. The other parts or rules or commandments, whatever you want to call them, one of the things we say is the golden rule. Well, the golden rule in the Bible is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But the golden rule for disruptors and disgruntled and protesters is don't take it personal. Okay, as soon as we start taking things personally, we start making bad decisions. Sometimes I get asked, well, how do you know that? Well, because I've done it myself as a young police officer. I know those times that I've taken things personally. Many times what followed after that was not a good decision. It was a decision based out of emotion. So the golden rule in these cases is not to take it personal. The other side of that is if you YouTube search for a protest that occurred at Pastor John Hagee's church, Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, mega church down there, on his Sunday, every Sunday, or once a year, they do a Christians United for Israel Sunday. And it's basically to show support for Israel. Well, one Sunday, I think it was 2011 or 12, they had Palestinian protesters that showed up and began to protest their church. About every 2 or 3 minutes, one of them would stand up and start disrupting and yelling things. And they had a textbook response to how you should handle a protest. Their church security team, most of them were off-duty officers in plain clothes, and they went up and asked people to leave. Didn't see any emotion out of the security team as far as an overreaction or anything else. And once those people were asked to leave, all of them complied. So that was a textbook response. If you want to see a textbook response, I thought they did a great job at that particular protest.
What is the difference when the security team takes the lead versus a freelance response from the congregation?
What we're doing is we're taking a subjective response, which is not pre-planned, to an objective response based on training, policies, protocols. In that particular case, it's also important to decide what are the rules of when we can use force. And having a use of force policy for our security team becomes very important, because who can use force and when they can use force is going to be very different depending on if you're law enforcement. Law enforcement can use force in 3 cases: protect themselves, protect others, and to take custody of people that are violating the law if they don't willfully go into custody. But civilians can only use force in 2 cases, which is to protect themselves, to protect others. So to make sure our security team understands when it's okay to use force. One of the other methods that we teach is simply a show of force, where 2 or 3 security personnel go over to the person that's disrupting and become a physical barrier to them to prevent them from getting close to the platform or to hurting somebody else, but just asking them to leave. And many times that's a response that's effective, because they're not there to harm anybody. They're there to get attention, and they're trying to elicit an overreaction. So having a plan in place, and then of course educating our pastoral leadership on how they need to direct the rest of the congregation while that protest or disruption is taking place. I can think of a protest in upper Midwest that took place where the pastor simply dismissed services because he was worried that this protest was going to get out of hand and was going to be an overreaction. So that took away fuel from the fire as well.
I've witnessed the benefit of having a security team in charge, and where the pastor can say, hey, let our security team handle it. as if there's something that comes up in the middle of the auditorium, or beforehand, as you mentioned, like there's notice that someone's coming. So what if you don't have a security team? What's the best you can make of the situation?
Well, in that case, pastoral leadership or operations leadership is going to need to ask them to leave, and tell them if they don't leave, they're going to be prosecuted for trespassing. And then and all we can do at that point is call the police and wait for them to get there to deal with it. We might have to stop services for just a while.
When it comes to church and our faith, for very good reasons, it's very personal to us. Um, at what point should a church, whether they have a security team or not, at what time do they need to contact the police? In what situation is it good to ask the police to come onto the property?
I would say anytime you have a disruption of service, whether it's disgruntled, maybe a disgruntled church member or otherwise, I would go ahead and get the police started, because what we don't know is what's going to happen. We can't predict the future and how this thing could escalate. So let's go ahead and call them and get them started. And then if it turns out we didn't need them, I would rather have them there and not need them than need them and not have them. So somebody who might be designated to go ahead and call the police and get them on the way. If you're doing simulcast of your church, we always recommend that when you're simulcasting your services, that you have at least a 30-second tape delay or a 1 minute to 2 minute tape delay. That way, if you have an interruption of services, whether it could be a medical, somebody having a cardiac emergency and services have to stop, or a protest, or even a violent event that occurs, now we can kill the feed through the simulcast and prevent that from being broadcast to everybody out there in the world. So having a tape delay would be good for that as well.
So, Vaughn, as we look at police presence, if we know, for example, that a group is coming to protest ahead of time, should we let the police know as a courtesy, or?
Yeah, I would let them know. That way, when they get a 911 call, they won't be surprised and wonder what is actually happening. And in fact, they might even choose to designate somebody to be present while those protests occur to prevent something from occurring and to be a deterrent. So, yeah, I would let them know if we knew in advance that a protest was going to happen. And most of the time, they're not going to call you and let you know, by the way. But if we are doing our job in security, monitoring social media chatter, we can become aware of those sorts of issues, especially if somebody uses a hashtag and says, "Hey, be here at this church at this time. We're getting ready to do a protest." The more people, the merrier, that sort of thing. So if we're doing our job to monitor social media, we might be able to come aware of it in advance as well.
And a lot of times our congregation can let us know about something like that, whereas a pastor or leadership team, they may not be attuned to social media, but usually somebody somewhere picks up on something like that and they can share and they can help us to be prepared. The opposite approach, we're talking about how to respond. What would be the top 2 or 3 things that you absolutely should not do when you're encountering protesters on your property?
And I don't want to say always and never are big words,
Mm-hmm.
but for the most part, your standard typical protester, we're not going to get physical with them. So that'd be the thing not to do. The other thing would be not to do is don't try to, because you're personally offended, don't try to escalate them. Many times they're going to be recording, and that's when you see the video at John Hagee's church of the Palestinian protesters. That video was actually taken by the protesters. They were documenting it because they were going to upload it and share it with as many people as possible after the fact. So we're not going to do anything that's going to look bad on camera. All of our responses, we want to be what we call camera friendly, and that not only means in word but also action as well. So, but most of the time, there's not a need to get physical. Again, unless you're trying to protect yourself or someone else from physical harm, there's no reason to get physical.
If you're hands off, and I assume also being soft spoken, particularly in terms of creating a media sensation, is also much more helpful than screaming at someone across a room.
What's the old saying? It's difficult to tell who's right, who the fool is when both people are yelling. They
Right.
both look like fools from a distance.
That's right.
So if we're under control when we speak and visit with them, it's going to look much better on camera.
It is interesting how it's become quite easy to cause a ruckus on social media. All you need is that phone in your pocket, right? And if you can provoke someone to say something harsh to you, and then you can go post it, it's one and done. Even if nothing really happened, and the vast majority of people didn't know it. So again, the more that we can educate people to respond properly, the better off we'll be. Tim pointed out in the chat that one of the biggest dilemmas here is not so much the protesters themselves, but the way that our people can respond. And you alluded to that too. How do church leaders, whether they be security leaders or pastoral leaders, how can they equip their people to know, hey, everything's all right. We don't need to sound 4 alarms here just because someone stands up and says, ibbity bobbity boop in the middle of the service.
Pastoral leadership is going to be critical during these situations. If people panic is going to be contagious. But in the absence of direction, people will self-direct, and self-direction usually looks like panic and chaos. So our leadership, pastoral leadership, if they're giving people direction, and that direction is calm, then that calm is going to be contagious, and it's less of a chance for that to escalate. So that's we educate people on that. Post event also, it's important in policy that we have a designated spokesperson as well, whether that's a pastor or somebody else who's going to be the spokesperson, not only to make a statement on social media, but also when the news shows up to find out, hey, what happened? Tell us your perspective. They said they were protesting you for this. And now is when we have an opportunity to show the love of Christ, but also get our perspective out there in a way that represents truth as well.
Vaughn, I know one thing that when I first heard of Strategos, it was in regards to training, and you're training volunteers, but sometimes professionals, but you're training security teams. What role does your training play in training security teams in regards to protests and protesters? What do you emphasize? How can you help teams to become more effective in responding to protests and interruptions?
Well, as far as that's concerned, what we'll do first is develop policy and protocol. But policy and protocol is a piece of paper in a file cabinet without the training. And the training is where we talk about it. And then what we do after that is we create a reasonable simulation in real life of what that training looks like. And we do scenarios where they get a chance to participate in a reasonable simulation where we can talk it afterwards and have the benefit of hindsight to do lessons learned. And one of the things we say frequently, my partner Mark says it all the time, is the body can't go where the mind has never been. So what we're trying to do is put the mind in that scenario in a training environment before we actually, God forbid, have to respond to it in real life.
At Ministry Pacific, from an insurance perspective, our goal is minimizing risk for you. Risk doesn't benefit anyone, and risk usually comes, as we talked about here today, when people lose their cool and touch or threaten a protester who usually their crime is simply being annoying, or if a security team member does that. And when it happens, it can certainly lead to bad publicity. But as Vaughn also alluded to earlier, it could land you in civil court. And so our primary recommendation to reduce risk is to have a professionally trained security team, and to also educate your people about how to respond to someone who is antagonistic but otherwise harmless. So if you have not connected with professional security training, we highly recommend Strategos, Vaughn and his team. By all means, invest in training. It's so much better to invest on the front end.
It's important you address it from an insurance perspective as well. There's different riders, and I know Ministry Pacific has one as well, but there's religious freedom riders. Because the accusation is going to be either that somebody overreacted or you're limiting my free speech. So it's important we have religious freedom coverage as well. So I think from an insurance perspective, that would be something important to address ahead of time as well.
Visit with us, consult, and just make sure that your coverage is going to do all the things for you that you want it to do. If you're looking for any kind of specific coverage, then we have a number that address things that go beyond just general liability insurance. We've talked about people not arguing or antagonizing. Do you have any thoughts on I think the good intent that someone may have of bringing coffee or donuts out to someone who is out holding a sign or shouting slogans or things like that, is that good idea, bad idea? Does it just depend?
I don't think it's a bad idea if you want to show them kindness and bring water, maybe food out to them. I don't think that's a bad idea. In fact, but I do think if your intent to do that as a pretext to try to debate them, I think that's a bad idea.
Hmm.
You're not going to convince anybody, especially when they have an audience, that to see your point of view. If they have an audience, they're going to be very invested in making sure that they get their point of view across. They really could care less what yours is. But to go out and be kind to somebody, I don't think is ever a bad idea. But if that's simply a pretext to debate them and try to convince them, one of the things I say frequently is, "Hey, just rest in the fact that you're right. There's no sense spending all your energy trying to convince everybody around you that you're right. And most of the time, if you're spending all your energy doing that, you're probably not right in the first place. Uh, if everybody's thinking you're wrong, but it just if the intent is to go out and try to debate them, that's probably not the right approach.
We've talked about our emotions getting involved, and I think it's inevitable. I mean, if we believe strongly about our faith, or really anything that we believe strongly about, if we feel like someone is on the sidelines ridiculing us, we feel that. But do we tend to overreact to protests, given the actual level of harm versus the perceived harm that usually can occur?
Yes, many times that's the case. I wouldn't say we typically do it, but absent training, absent preparing in advance, we typically will become emotional about it, especially if somebody's coming to our home, if they're coming to our uh, people we care about, and to our church. Many times people will overreact. So that is a valid concern.
And again, training is the cornerstone of all this. Conversely, what are some signs that we need to look for uh, if we're beginning to be concerned that this may go beyond a mere freedom of speech issue, and that this could be a protest that potentially get out of hand? What do we need to be looking for or aware of?
Sure. Yeah. Well, knowing that all bad acts are preceded by bad behavior, uh, what are some of the body language and what are some of the behavior indicators that we're looking for? Well, uh, even before the protest occurs, you might see people, and again, we look at it from what's normal versus abnormal. Hey, the speaker's on stage, the speaker's speaking, or the worship leader's leading worship, but that person's attention is somewhere else. They're looking around nervously. Maybe they're wiping their hands on their pants. They have what we call happy feet. They're restless.
Hmm.
Uh, all of those things looking for normal, abnormal. Once we've decided to have dialogue with the protesters, and some of the other behavior indicators that we see, or body language indicators, might be a person that starts blading on you. That means their strong leg is starting to position behind their weak leg, and now we're getting ready, and it starts to look like a fighting stance. If we start see hands that start turning into clenched fists, that's behavior indicators that this thing could end up getting close to escalating. If we see flushed face, rapid breathing, teeth that are clenched, those are all precursors to conflict, physical conflict. So those are some of the behavior indicators we start looking for, and so we can prepare in advance.
And it sounds like really the key there is just having a security team that's well versed in just watching people, observing people.
Exactly, and all of us at some point in our life have maybe behaved in a way we wish we hadn't have. And if many times the disgruntled person's in that category, they feel justified in their act until later. There is such a thing as acting based on being right, but doing it in the wrong way. So you're letting your feelings and voicing your concerns, and you're just doing it in the wrong way, even though you might be justified in what you believe. So trying to look at it from their point of view, and seeing it from their perspective. And that's one of the principles of de-escalation is, one, summarize where you think they're coming from, and two is trying to see things from their perspective and at least showing some empathy. Empathy is a really important piece of de-escalation.
It seems like de-escalation is really one of the key tools in the full church security arena, whereas maybe traditionally or stereotypically we'll look at ways to fight and stop people, but if you never have to get there, you're so far ahead of the game.
Well, sometimes de-escalation gets looked at as a word, a warm, fuzzy word. Most of the time, we can de-escalate with good people skills and good de-escalation strategies. But sometimes, in order to de-escalate a situation, particularly one that's violent, we have to escalate our approach. And so, in order to de-escalate those few instances, we have to escalate our personal approach to de-escalate the situation itself. So it's not always a warm fuzzy word, but most of the time we can de-escalate the warm fuzzy way.
Well, let's kind of look at this. Say that we drive in, and there are protesters at our church. Maybe we knew they were going to be there. Maybe we didn't. At the end of the day, what's the best possible outcome that, say, the pastor can look back? He's like, "Oh, that's behind us." What's the best possible outcome, and what's the worst outcome?
Well, best possible outcome is our testimony is intact. Both our organizational testimony, our church testimony, our pastor's testimonial, and what is the perception? If people that don't have a dog in the fight can objectively look at that recorded event and say, "Man, those protesters were way out of line," then that's a win. And now maybe they start listening to the message afterwards with an interview with a reporter that were somebody that is well reasoned and logical and can speak truth with grace and love. That maybe we've just won somebody over at that point. So I would call that a win. A loss is where those perspectives aren't seen by the outsider, and we've damaged not only our personal and our corporate testimony, but we've damaged the testimony of our faith in what we represent, which is Christ and His testimony, because they think that because we are Christ followers, that must be how what Christ teaches, and it isn't.
Jameson, who I believe you mentioned at the beginning, said some churches do have a high profile political or cultural stance or figures or members, and this could lead to a higher risk of protest or disruption. Is there anything that can be done in those situations?
Depending on how high profile they are, or what political office, or what net worth, or what is the reason that they're at higher risk, they may have their own protection resources, but if they don't, they have just as much right as anybody to be safe when they come into your church as anything. So we might have to specifically designate resources to make sure they stay safe. But knowing that those people do come to your church, and when we do our risk assessment, knowing that hey, that alone could increase risk and make your church the target just because that person comes to your church, it would be good to know in advance. So that's a great point that Jameson brings out as far as knowing who those people are and how that elevates risk.
Vaughn, you mentioned, Ted is asking this question. You mentioned a code of conduct for the church and congregation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Do you have any more information that might be available?
Absolutely. And if anybody wants to email me, I'd be happy to email them a template of that code of conduct. We recommend all churches have a code of conduct for that. And again, the reason for that is, and you're going to see people that come in specifically to try to create an opportunity to pursue litigation. And a code of conduct is a great tool to prevent that from occurring. And basically what it does is it says, this is the conduct that we're going to allow in our church. We developed this, by the way, this template with a law firm that has argued 9 or 10 religious freedom cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. But this code of conduct outlines what behavior you're going to allow according to your statement of faith of your church. And so I'd be happy to share that with anybody that thinks that could be useful for them. But we do recommend that in this day and age that all churches have a code of conduct.
Linda asks, what if a protester, essentially if a protest turns violent and someone who originally was just making a statement, pops somebody or threatens somebody? What's the next step?
Well, it's important to know that everybody has a right to be safe, and we have a right to defend ourselves from harm. Now we're getting into justification for use of force, appropriate use of force, by the way, which is only that force that's reasonably necessary to de-escalate that particular event. And what that is a person is trying to hurt somebody else, or the behavior that they're engaging in is likely to or could cause harm to others. Now we are justified in using a justifiable force against that individual. And we would like that person that is using force to be appropriately trained. And again, using force techniques that are camera friendly. Sometimes you just can't be camera friendly. It turns into looks ugly. But as long as it's reasonable force, then we can defend it post event.
Well, as we're winding down our time here, I wanted to give you, Vaughn, an opportunity to talk about, as you feel relevant, any training and consulting that Strategos does that can be of value to churches, not only in this arena, but all areas related to security.
What I would like to let everybody know here is in October, we're going to be doing our 4th annual National Christian Protectors Conference. And whether you're a professional protector, law enforcement, fire, EMS, military, we'd love to have you attend. Also, if you serve on a church security team, or if you just fall under the category of protector, a protector defined as somebody who's responsible for the care of another, and that's most all of us. If we have family members, we'd invite you to this conference, 2-day conference. Gonna have some great speakers there. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman is going to be there to speak. Chris Tanto Peranto will be there, star of the movie 13 Hours, but also a hero that was at Benghazi. I had an opportunity to have lunch with him a few months ago. Great, humble guy, super humble guy. We've got Adam Davis, dynamic speaker, Pastor Phil Hopper, pastor of a mega church, but also a former SWAT officer with Kansas City Police Department. Eli Crane, he's a U.S. congressman, is going to be there, former Navy SEAL as well. He's going to be speaking. So we've got some real world changer speakers that are going to be there. Not only that, be plenty of opportunity to do training. We're going to have breakout sessions and lots of different training topics. So if you're interested in that, we'd encourage you to go to our website. And it's strategosintl.com/conference. And you can see all about that conference. And we'd love to see you there in October.
And I will say, being in Kansas City, October is a beautiful time to be in Kansas City for sure. And I have been to this conference myself. Extremely thorough, great opportunities for pastors, church administrators, security team members, volunteers. So definitely check it out and check in with Vaughn with other questions or consultations. At Ministry Pacific, we encourage you to get trained, to consult. We hope that this is the beginning of a conversation with you and your board or your team or your staff. If you're with a nonprofit organization, you could be your board and your staff as well. And being ready and having a plan, because none of us do well on the fly, particularly with issues like this that are emotionally charged and that have the potential hazards as well. So we encourage you to consult with Vaughn and his team, get informed, and also we encourage you to share this webinar. If it can help some colleagues in ministry, then by all means share it with them. In terms of your insurance coverage and what it can do for you to consult and make sure that you have what you need to cover your liabilities and protect you from risk, please consult with us. Vaughn, any final thoughts here today?
No, just thanks for taking the time. And well, like we usually say, is I hope everything you learned today was a complete waste of time and it's never needed. But at least you'll have some information that would hopefully you find useful to respond to one of these things if they do occur.
That's right. And there's no way it'll be a waste of time, because just having a plan allows us to be able to focus on the areas of ministry that are before us without having to wonder what might happen if this happens or the other. So, well, we wish everybody the best, and thank you so much for joining us, and let us know how we can be of service. Thank you, Vaughn.